Hello and welcome to Spotting Slots. I'm your host, Commander Anchor. In this series, we try to look at new Magic the Gathering cards that are coming out and assess them through the eyes of Commander players. When we look at cards in this series, we're going to assess them in 4 different ways. The first is what cards already exist that are similar to it, and what is the difference between those cards and this card? How is this new card unique? 2, what kind of card is it? Does it have a specific functionality such as draw or ramp, or is it something different altogether? Does it have a strategy or archetype that it fits into? 3, what synergies and combos exist with this card? And finally, what commanders would be really good to helm this card in the 99? Quick disclaimer, when I'm considering the quality of cards one against another, I'm almost never considering the flavor wins. When I'm building my own decks, I consider that a lot, but that's just not the part of assessing cards for this series. So the inspiration for this video is that there's going to be a new Magic set coming out January 24th called Theros Beyond Death, which is the sequel to the 2013 Theros block. So earlier than the normal release schedule, we had about a 40 card leak. I'm going to review one card of each color from that leak. The first card we're going to look at today is called Furious Rise. It's a red enchantment for 2 generic and 1 red mana. That reads, at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with the power of 4 or greater, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. This card's function for red is simply draw. Red doesn't have the best draw cards, it's very limited in what it can do, and this is an additional card in the arsenal of what's been dubbed Impulsive Draw, which is draw that you have temporary access to. So 2 good examples are Light Up the Stage, which is a red sorcery for 2 generic and 1 red, which has exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. So it is giving you card advantage and allowing you to get further into your deck without the discard effects that red's known for in wheels and looting. Another good example is the 2019 Commander product Ignite the Future, 3 generic and a red for a sorcery. Exile the top 3 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. If this card was cast from a graveyard, you may play those cards without paying their mana cost. It's got a flashback for 7 and a red. So you can see how red has a few cards that do this, but this is nice because unlike many of the other red ones like Light Up the Stage and Ignite the Future, where you only have access to the cards for 1 turn and then the effect is gone, this is going to give you access to a new card every turn. So it's a little bit more like red's version of draw 1 card. So I think this card's pretty good. It does have a condition on it, which is that you have to have that creature with the power of 4 or greater. This isn't to say that this card is one of the best red card draws we've seen, but certainly where your commander has 4 power or greater, you'll see this card actually get you a pretty good amount of value. There is a little bit of a win more attitude attached to this card. That's, hey, if my commander has power 4 or greater and it's able to stay out for multiple turns in a row, I'm going to continue to generate all of this card advantage between my commander, which has power 4 or greater, and this card, which is giving me 1 more card a turn. So there is a little bit of a weakness in that if people are already trying to remove your commander because that's the biggest threat, and it's the only thing that's keeping Furious Rise churning more cards into your deck, then you've put all of your eggs in one basket and it becomes fairly easy for someone to hinder you by just removing your commander. Now, instead of just not having your commander on your board, they've also turned off your conditional card draw. Now that we've talked about the card a little bit, we have a better understanding of what its function is in a deck and what are some of the other alternatives you might be playing with it. We're going to look at some commanders where the synergy between this card and those commanders looks to be fairly powerful. So that brings us to our next section. We're going to look at some mono red commanders first, starting with Neheb the Eternal. 5 mana, 3 generic, and 2 red for a legendary creature Zombie Minotaur Warrior. Comes out as a 4/6. It has Afflict 3 whenever this creature becomes blocked. Defending player loses 3 life. And at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add 1 red mana to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So often with Neheb, you have a lot of mana, but because of red's limited draw, you often don't have all the cards to play. The synergy between these 2 cards is what gets me the most excited. You can play Furious Rise a turn or 2 before Neheb comes out. The turn you play Neheb, assuming you don't have haste, you'll still generate that 1 card advantage, and the next turn, when you're first attacking with Neheb, you'll have that card from the last turn to play with your additional mana, and it will just synergize turn after turn in this way, that the card I got last turn becomes an option for me next turn with the mana I have with Naiad. A second really strong commander that we're looking at is Atali Primal Storm, 4 generic and 2 red for a legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur. 6/6, whenever Atali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So similar to Naiad, Furious Rise comes out before Atali, Atali comes out, and you're going to start generating the value immediately. Atali decks, you get a lot of free plays, so seeing further into your deck, figure out which cards you want to play with that. It's often very powerful. Specifically, one of the things I really like with Furious Rise and Atali is that even if Atali gets removed, when you're getting cards off every player's deck, including your own, you're likely going to put something that's a 4/4 out anyway, so Furious Rise will stay active even if Atali gets single target removed. The third mono red commander we're going to look at is Lathliss Dragon Queen, 4 generic and 2 red for a legendary creature dragon. 6/6 flyer with whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. Also has 1 generic and a red. Dragons you control get 1/0 until end of turn. So similar to Atali, I like that as you play your cards out of your deck, you play additional dragons. You're going to put out those 5/5s, and even if Lathliss gets destroyed, the 5/5 is still above 4 power, and Furious Rise will still continue to get you that additional advantage at the end of your turn. The next commander is Ilrog the Razeboar, 3 generic and 2 red for a legendary creature Boar God. 6/6 trample. Whenever Ilrog the Razeboar attacks, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Return that creature to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. The thing that should jump out at you is that you can't actually play the card you're getting with Furious Rise with Ilrog's ability because the card isn't in your hand. So in that way, I think that these two cards are total nombo. The synergy is not there, but you are often working with a lot of extra mana in Ilharg decks because you're getting free temporary creature plays, and that lets you open up your mana for a couple of other things. The creatures don't stick out, so you still need to be committing things to the board. Furious Rise will get you a little deeper in your deck to do that. The only problem is that you'll never be able to free play a creature that you get off of Furious Rise with Ilharg. So I don't think the card is unplayable, but I don't think it's particularly strong here. The final commander, and the commander that I think is the best with this card, is called Hazoret the Fervent. 3 generic and 1 red for a legendary creature god. 5/4 indestructible haste. Hazoret the Fervent can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. 3 mana, 2 generic and 1 red. Discard a card. Hazoret deals 2 damage to each opponent. I think the first thing to note here is that Hazoret is 4 mana, so you can play Furious Rise on turn 3, and the next turn play out Hazoret and immediately start generating that value. The next thing is that Hazoret is indestructible, so it's very difficult for people to turn off your Furious Rise by simply destroying your commander. They have to exile it. Following that, Hazoret is actually looking for you to have less cards in hand so that it can attack. And you'll still be drawing your normal cards for turn and some of your other red cards that draw you, which will enable you to still use Hazoret's discard effect while actually having cards to continue to play. So Hazoret the Fervent is my pick for the best synergistic card with Furious Rise. Okay, for our next card, we're going over to green, and this one's a creature. It's Ilysian Caryatid. It's 1 generic and a green for a 1/1 creature plant with tap, add 1 mana of any color. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, add 2 mana of any one color instead. So this is going to fulfill the purpose of green ramp. So there's a lot of green mana ramp and a lot of green mana dorks, which is those little creatures that tap for mana in various ways. This one's particularly nice off the bat because it's tapping for any color, and later on, once you fulfill the requirement of having a creature with the power 4 or greater, it can tap for 2 mana rather than just the 1. Now there are a lot of different green mana dorks out there, so we're going to have a few things to compare this to, just to narrow down exactly in what ways this one's better and which commanders this is going to go best in. Often considered the best mana dork, Bloom Tender, 1 generic and 1 green for a 1/1 elf druid. Tap it. For each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. So this is the same floor as Ilysian Caryatid, but a much higher ceiling. So I think we can safely say that Bloom Tender is going to be better in almost every scenario outside of mono green. Next up, we're going to look at two options. Sylvan Caryatid, which is a 1 generic, 1 green, 0/3 plant with Defender and Hexproof with tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And Incubation Druid, which is 1 generic and 1 green for an Elf Druid 0/2 with tap, add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. If Incubation Druid has a 1/1 counter on it, add 3 mana of any type instead. Has Adapt 3 for 3 generic and 2 green, which is if this creature has no 1/1 counters on it, put 3 1/1 counters on it. So I think these two are really good comparisons for Ilysian Caryatid because they are at base very similar, but depending on exactly what commander you're running and what style deck you're running, you'll want to pick one of these over another. Picking Sylvan Caryatid when you want a higher number of defenders, or you need your creatures to have hexproof, or you need the extra toughness. Incubation Druid when you're dealing with a deck with lots of 1/1 counters on it, where it might come out as a 0/2, but you're not going to have to rely on its adaptability to get at the 1/1 counters. Maybe in a deck that just the commander puts 1/1 counters on creatures, Incubation Druid's going to see a lot of work. But where you want Ilysian Caryatid is where your commander or a lot of the creatures in the deck have power 4 or greater. So any deck where the power 4 or greater matters sort of more than some of these other mana dorks, this one's going to be better. And then lastly, we have kind of a classification of mana dorks where I think Ilysian Caryatid sort of generically is just better than all of these. I'm not going to read them all out, but Utopia Tree, Paradise Druid, and Drover of the Mighty, they all have these kind of effects where it's like, hey, this thing might be a little bit better in this kind of deck. Paradise Druid having Hexproof, Utopia Tree having a little bit more toughness, Drover of the Mighty getting bigger if you have dinosaurs. But all of that pales in comparison to the upper echelon of Ilysian Caryatid, which is that it produces more than 1 mana, especially when you consider your mana dorks for later in the game. If you draw one of these, 2 mana gives you 1 mana later in the game, that's okay, but if you draw 2 mana gives you 2 mana, it means that you're just able to buy that extra mana a lot faster, pay for itself very quickly. So wrapping up the comparisons, I think that if you're looking at the 2 slot for a mana dork, this is a very strong card, especially in a deck where that second half where it's going to get turned on to that 2 mana a lot easier, where you have a lot of cards that fulfill that requirement. There are a lot of very interesting synergies and combos with this card. We're going to go into some of them right now. We're going to start with just a bunch of other cards from other sets that just care about the power of a creature. There was a set about 2007, Alara, Shards of Alara around that time, where the power 5 or greater mattered. So anything that has the power of 5 or greater, you're also going to be looking at the power of 4 or greater. I think that a very good comparative card to this is Drum Hunter, 3 generic and 1 green for a human druid warrior 2/2. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with the power of 5 or greater, you may draw a card. You can tap it to add 1 generic color to your mana pool. I think these cards are very similar in the way that they're both concerned with having this quote-unquote large creature to give them more value and make them better cards. So basically, any deck that currently exists that has a Drum Hunter in it, you can definitely look at Ilysian Caryatid to go into that deck. A couple more cards that care about this 5 or greater aspect that you can look at these cards to get ideas for where Ilysian Caryatid can go. First is Mysoid or Mycoid Shepherd, which is 1, 2 green, and 1 white for a 5/4 fungus with whenever this or another creature you control with power 5 or greater is put into a graveyard from play, you may gain 5 life. Next is Vagrant Plow Beast, which is 5, a green, and a white for a 6/6 beast with tap 1 generic, regenerate target creature with the power of 5 or greater. Spearbreaker Behemoth, 5 generic and 2 green for a 5/5 beast. It's indestructible. You can tap 1 generic and target creature with the power of 5 or greater is indestructible. And finally, Rakeclaw Gargantuan, 2 generic, red, white, green, or for a 5/3 beast with tap 1 generic and target creature with a 5 or power or greater gains first strike until end of turn. So all of these, you can use mana to make them 5 or greater. They'll all turn on Ilysian Caryatid. They're all already surrounded and care about cards and creatures with the power of 5 or greater. So we can see a lot of synergies with cards around that theme. Next, we're going to go over a couple of combos that exist with this card. So there's a series of combos that require a creature that taps for more than 1 mana and one of 2 blue enchantments. So this is only going to work with Ilysian Caryatid in a blue-green or blue-green plus deck. The 2 enchantments are Feed from the Real, which is 2 generic, 1 blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature, tap 1 blue, untap enchanted creature. and Penman's Aura, which is 1 generic and 2 blue for a bunch of abilities, but again, the one that we're concerned with is 1 blue untap enchanted creature. So if you have something that makes Ilysian Caryatid or another creature larger than 4, so it's tapping for 2, you can tap to create an infinite amount of mana by tapping it to create blue and untapping it to then tap it again to create more mana. And you can do it to create any color mana because you can just make enough blue to be able to untap it to make enough red, so on and so forth. So it's infinite of any color mana. There is a pretty nice Pauper infinite mana combo where you can use Feed from the Real, Ilysian Caryatid, and a green card called Vines of Vastwood, which is 1 green and a kicker for a green. Target creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control this turn. If Vines of Vastwood was kicked, that creature gets +4/+4. So obviously just the Feed from the Real and Ilysian Caryatid makes infinite mana if you have another creature with the power of 4 or greater, but Vines of Vastwood will protect Ilysian Caryatid and make it the creature that has that power. So it's one way to get it. The combo itself works regardless. You don't need the Vines of Vastwood, but I think that the 3-card combo really protects the infinite mana. Moving on to the commanders that this works particularly well with. I think there are a couple of mono green ones we're going to go over first, starting with a bunch of green commanders that start as 4/4s, and you probably want to play a lot of creatures, and you probably want a lot of mana for. So Yorvo, Lord of Garenbridge, which is green for a legendary creature giant noble. Yorvo, Lord of Garenbridge, enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters on it. Whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Yorvo. Then, if that creature's power is greater than Yorvo's power, put another 1/1 counter. So you're just going to want to be dumping big creatures onto the board, and Ilysian Caryatid will tap for 2 as soon as Yorvo comes out, and probably you'll put a bunch of other 4/4s out, so if Yorvo gets removed, it won't even matter. Next is Yeva, Nature's Herald, 2 generic, 2 green, legendary creature Elf Shaman 4/4. It's got flash, and you can cast green creature spells as though they had flash. So again, commander comes out as a 4/4. That's going to turn on the Ilysian Caryatid, and you're going to be able to just play more green creatures. Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma, 3 generic, 1 green, legendary creature Bear. It's a 4/3. Creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. So whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1. So this deck is surrounding itself with creatures with power 4 or greater and making them cheaper to cast to begin with. So you can imagine how on turn 2 you play Ilysian Caryatid, on turn 3 you play Goreclaw, and on turn 4 you could easily play, even if you miss your land drop, you've still got the 3 lands, the 2 from Ilysian Caryatid and the 2 from Goreclaw, so you could play 6 drops pretty easily, 7 drops even. And that scenario is extremely unoptimized. We're talking about one where we have no additional ramp and where we've missed land drops. Imagine the 10 drops that you can play if you have other ramp and you are hitting your land drops. Very powerful in Goreclaw for sure. Moving outside of mono green, we're going to look at Jirid, Conclave Exile, 2 generic, red, green, white for a legendary creature human shaman. He's a 2/5, but he has, when he enters the battlefield, create a 4/4 green rhino creature token with trample, and whenever he attacks, populate, which is to populate, create a token that's a copy of a creature token you control. So pretty quickly, he's going to put out a second 4/4, which means that even if one of them gets removed, your Ilysian Caryatid will still be online, tapping for 2 mana. Moving over to Temur, we have another synergistic card, Temur Ascendancy, which is green, blue, red. Creatures you control have haste, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So these 2 cards work really well together. Your creatures will have haste. You'll be able to play big creatures. Once you have those big creatures, you'll be drawing cards. You'll be able to play more of them because Ilysian Caryatid will tap for more mana. 2 commanders that I think both of these cards work really well in are Animar, Soul of Elements, which is green, red, blue for a 1/1 elemental, protection from white and black. Whenever you cast a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Animar, and creature spells you cast cost 1 less for each 1/1 counter on Animar. So there's some competitive builds for Animar, and I'm not sure if this has a space in those builds, but in the non-competitive Animars, you'll still just be ramping super hard. Even if you play Animar first and then play this, it means that Animar will be a 2/2. It can tap for 1 mana. On your next turn, you'll be able to play another creature, which will quickly get Animar up to 4 and allow Ilysian Caryatid to help you hit more of those creatures. Surak Dragonclaw, 2 generic, green, red, blue for a legendary creature human warrior. He's a 6/6 with flash. He can't be countered. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and other creatures you control have trample. So you're going to be putting out some big, uncounterable creatures that are all gonna cost a bunch of mana, and you can use Ilysian Caryatid to tap for 2 of that. So to wrap up, I want to say that generically, I think this card's very powerful in any deck where you can use a mana dork and your commander or other cards you're going to be playing are going to often have the power of 4 or greater. I think that this is encapsulated sort of the all-encompassing way that this card is very good in a lot of places by looking at the top 10 most played Jund commanders over the course of the last 2 years from EDH Rec. So number 1 is Lord Windgrace, and that's a Planeswalker, so he's not going to be able to turn on Ilysian Caryatid, so that's not particularly useful. But the next 4 all have power 4 or greater. Corvold Fakehurst King has power 4/4, Prosh Skyraider of Kur has a power of 5/5, Victus Asmadi the Dire has a power of 6/6, Thantis the Warweaver has a power of 5/5, then we have the 6th most popular commander in Jund, Kresh the Bloodbraided, which is a 3/3 legendary creature with whenever another creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may put X 1/1 counters on Kresh the Bloodbraided, where X is that creature's power, so the first time anything dies, as long as it has any power whatsoever, Kresh will be a 4/4 and turn on Ilysian Caryatid. The next one is Shattergang Brothers, which is a 3/3 and doesn't by itself get any bigger, so that goes into the Lord Windgrace category of not working with Ilysian Caryatid. And the final 3 do Sekuar, Deathkeeper, comes out as a 4/3. Gyrus, Waker of Corpses, is 3 mana and X, and it's going to come out as an XX, so just make X greater than 4, or 4 or greater, and you'll be fine. And then Wasitora, Nakoru Queen, comes out as a 5/4. So all of these commanders can have this card used in it. Does it synergize with every one of their strategies? You got to check out those commanders if you want to know, but almost every single commander, 8 of the top 10, synergize fairly well with this card, just base look off the bat, just what their power is, what this card does. I think that speaks to the generic, very powerful strength of this mana dork, and it giving you that 2 mana for 2 mana. So our next card is Naiad of the Hidden Coves. It is an enchant creature nymph 2/3 for 2 generic and a blue. As long as it's not your turn, spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. So I'm a big fan of these kinds of mana producers. I think that in the right scenarios, they really end up saving you a lot of mana or functionally end up producing a lot of mana. This leads us to look at the cards that are similar to this. The first one on our list is Helm of Awakening, which is an artifact for 2 generic mana that says all spells cost 1 generic mana less to play. Next, we have a series of 5 cards. They're a different gem and then the word medallion. They're all 2 generic mana, and they all have a color spells cost 1 less to cast. I've thrown all of them on the screen, but Emerald Medallion's the green one. It says green spells cost 1 less to cast. Cloud Key, which is 3 generic mana for an artifact. As Cloud Key comes into play, choose artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery. Spells you play of the chosen type cost 1 less to play. Foundry Inspector, 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature construct. Artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Goblin Electromancer, 1 red, 1 blue for a 2/2 Goblin Wizard. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So let's go back through this list. We had Helm of Awakening, which for only 2 mana was going to mean that everyone, including your opponent's cards, cost 1 less. Still a great card. You just try to put in decks where you're going to abuse it more than your opponent. The medallions, which are color specific. Cloud Key, which enables you to pick a specific super type, be it artifact or creature or enchantment. So you can put Cloud Key in an enchantment deck, and then when you play it, you're mostly going to say enchantment. Foundry Inspector, which is an artifact that makes artifacts cheaper. Goblin Electromancer is going to make instants and sorceries cheaper. So we've seen that this effect exists, and you usually try to see what the specific limitation to your cards are. So Goblin Electromancer makes instants and sorceries less, so you're really only going to want to put that in a deck with a critical mass of instants or sorceries, or a deck that can abuse the fact that your instants or sorceries cost 1 less. So similar to the rest of these mana reducers, you want to put it in a deck that's going to have a critical mass of the thing that you're reducing. So in this case, Naiad of Hidden Coves is either going to need to go into a deck that's already trying to play everything on as many people's turns as possible, or a specifically instant-oriented deck so that the amount of mana reduced can be as high as possible to get the best value out of this. So we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the commanders that are most oriented to these strategies, the first of which is Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter.
2 generic, a green, and a blue for a legendary creature Elf Druid, 2/3. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a non-land card with converted mana cost less than that spell's, you can cast it without paying its mana cost. If you don't
cast the revealed card, put it into your hand. Rashmi decks often are looking to generate as much value as possible off of Rashmi's ability by getting at least one cast off on each turn, triggering Rashmi as often as possible. The worst case scenario being that you get to draw the top card of your library. So Naiad of the Hidden Coves is going to let you play more cards on each turn by making the casts on your opponent's turn cost 1 less. So you can sort of think of the card in a Rashmi deck as, hey, for the cards you cast on your opponent's turn, it's going to be 1 mana less, which means that I'm going to generate 3 mana per round, assuming you're actually going to get to play 1 card on each opponent's turn. That's a little bit optimistic thinking, but the synergy is certainly there where you're going to be looking to play cards on opponent's turn, and this is going to enable that, giving you more resources to do so by reducing the mana cost of those cards.
The next card came from the 2019 Commander Precons, Elsha of the Infinite, 2 generic, blue, red, white for a legendary creature Jin Monk. It has prowess, so whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it's going to get 1/1 until end of turn. You can look at the top card of your library anytime. You can cast the top card of your library if it's a non-creature, non-land card, and you can cast it as though it had flash. So this is going to give you the ability to play cards on other people's turns at instant speed for less mana. So a lot of Elsha decks want to play at the end of the turn before to really double up on turns and get to be that explosive. If you're running some of the higher CEDH level Elsha decks, play your entire deck infinite combo Sensei's Divining Top, where you have Sensei's Divining Top mana cost reduced by 1. It now costs nothing. You could tap it to draw a card, and then with Elsha you can play it off the top, so you get to play your entire deck. So this enables that combo. It just can't be done on your turn. And then I think that you could see how in a slightly lower tier deck, Naiad of the Hidden Coves is still going to be very valuable, because as you look to play those cards off the top, their mana cost will be reduced. And since they have flash, you can do that on other people's turns and not particularly concerned with the other limitations that would normally bring.
The next commander up we have is Izzet, Jori-En Ruin Diver, 1 generic, blue and red. For a legendary creature Merfolk Wizard, it's a 2/3. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, draw a card. So Jori-En decks, they're really trying to get to that second card on every turn, including their opponent's turns, to generate the value off of Jori-En to get you a little bit deeper. So because you're looking to cast upwards of 6 spells that aren't on your turn, Naiad of the Hidden Coves can really generate a lot of value for a Jori-En deck that's trying to cast those cards in the first place. The last commander we're going to go over is Mono Blue, Talrand Sky Summoner, 2 generic and 2 blue. For a legendary creature Merfolk Wizard, 2/2. With whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. This deck is often run with counter magic as the pivotal point of it, or just instants in general. So if you're going to be casting a lot of instants and you're going to be doing them on your opponent's turns to answer what they're doing, then you'll see that Naiad of the Hidden Coves will generate a lot of value here.
The next card is Funeral Rite. It's a black sorcery for 2 generic and 1 black. It says, you draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, and put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. We see effects like this get printed in black. Most sets, something that's draw a little, lose a little life. But the exact CMC, if it's an instant or sorcery, how much life you're playing, what the additional effect that might be printed on the card, tends to differ a little bit. So we're going to rapid fire off a bunch of cards. So from the most recent set, we have Foreboding Fruit, 2 generic and a black, so the exact same mana cost. It's sorcery speed, so exact same speed. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Okay, that's the same. It also has Adamant. If at least 3 black mana was spent to cast this spell, create a food token. Food tokens are an artifact that have tap 2 generic and tap it to sack it and gain 3 life. Okay, so if you need that artifact for some reason and you're running in mono black, Foreboding Fruit might be better. Next we have Night's Whisperer, which is 1 generic and 1 black sorcery speed. You draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life, so doesn't have the modularity to be able to do it to an opponent in case they only have 2 life left, or if you have a teammate in some variants of Commander, like Secret Partners, you may be able to let your partner draw 2. Painful Lessons, 2 generic, 1 black, sorcery speed, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Read the Bones, 2 generic, 1 black, scry 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. The scry effect probably makes Sign of Blood better in a lot of scenarios. Then you have Succumb to Temptation, which is instant speed, 1 generic, 2 black, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. And finally, we have Sign in Blood, which is 2 black, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. So we're seeing a lot of variations here between 2 and 3 mana, exactly how many black pips it's going to be, a sorcery instant speed, if you can have another player do it or have you do it. So there's a lot of minutia here into deciding exactly which of these effects you want in your deck. You have a lot of options. If you're in a mono black deck, you might be running quite a few of these, as they're pretty common ways that black has to draw cards. So the thing that separates Funeral Rites from all these other cards is that last little bit that says put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. So we're going to be looking at decks that want more cards in their graveyard, and this is just the best version of this little limited draw that can go in any of those decks. So one of these mill decks that's specifically looking to dump creatures into the graveyard, this might be a little bit worse just because there are creatures with a similar effect. I think at the end of the day, you're still going to want to include this. There's only so many draw cards that are in black. This is only going to be one of them. If you're looking at, let's say, 9 or 10 draw cards, this could certainly be an include, even if you're looking to get more ETB draw in a self-mill deck. So the first card we're going to look at comes in mono black, Balthar the Defiled, 2 generic and 2 black, zombie dwarf legend, 2/2, all minions get +1/+1, but it's the second effect that we're much more concerned about. It's 3 black, remove Balthar the Defiled from the game. Each player returns all black and all red creature cards from his or her graveyard to play, so this card is going to help you dump more cards into your graveyard, hopefully see more creatures get in there while you're drawing into other cards that you need to set up for the Balthar play. Next up is Gisa and Geralf, or Geralf. 2 generic, a blue, and a black, legendary creature, human wizard, 4/4. When Gisa and Geralf enters the battlefield, put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard, and during each of your turns, you may cast a zombie creature card from your graveyard. So, again, Funeral Rites is just going to draw you a couple cards, give you that card advantage, but also, if you put a zombie in your graveyard from the mill, you're just still going to be able to play it with Gisa and Geralf's ability. Third on our list is Sir Conrad the Grim, 3 generic, 2 black for a legendary creature human knight. He's a 5/4. Whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. You could tap 2. Each player puts the top card of their library into his graveyard. So for 1 more mana, you're going to get to draw 2 and put the top 2 of your library in the graveyard. Again, this should be stacked with creatures. You should be able to mill a few creatures with this, maybe get some damage, and you're still getting the draw. The mill is incidental. So where it's incidentally good, Funeral Rites is going to be a very strong card. After that, we're looking at Gerard Golgari Lichlord, 2 black, 2 green for a legendary creature zombie elf, 2/2. And it's got 1/1 for each creature card in your graveyard. And you can sacrifice a swamp and a forest to return it from your graveyard to your hand. You can tap 1, a black and a green to sacrifice another creature. Each opponent loses life equal to the sacrifice creature's power. So the top part of this is what we're looking at. He gets 1/1 for each creature in your graveyard. That's going to mean you want more creatures in your graveyard. Ergo, that mill can put more creatures in your graveyard. Azoni Thousand Eyes, 2 generic, 2 black, 2 green. For a 2/3 legendary creature shaman elf with undergrowth. When it enters the battlefield, you can create a 1/1 black-green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. That's going to be good. So all of these cards that we've just listed, Gisa and Geralf, Balthar the Defiled, Sir Conrad the Grim, Gerard Golgari Lichlord, and Azoni Thousand Eyes are all looking to have more creatures in the graveyard. Funeral Rites is going to incidentally put them there sometimes, and you're going to get the draw that you're going to get off many of these other options that we talked about. I think this is where this card sees the best play. Finally, I'm going to briefly go over Kess Dissident Mage, Muldrotha the Gravetide, and the Gitrog Monster, which all have very competitive builds. I don't think that this is particularly strong in the competitive versions, but briefly, the Gitrog Monster has an effect where whenever 1 or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you draw a card. So this is going to be you paying 3 mana to draw 2 cards, with the potential upside of drawing a few more. Muldrotha lets you play permanents, 1 of each kind, from your graveyard each turn, so you can draw a few cards and then potentially get something in your graveyard that you're looking to play. So on the 3 mana, you'll sort of see 4 deep. Kess Dissonant Mage has during each of your turns, you can cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, so this is going to fill your graveyard with a few more instants of sorceries. So again, I don't know that this is really going to be competitive. I'm not sure it's aggressively costed enough to see that kind of play, but otherwise in slightly less competitive builds, I do think this is going to cause great value. The deck that I think that Funeral Rites is going to be the best in is I know this is where I'm putting it in my collection. Hogak Arisen Necropolis, 5 generic and 2 hybrid black-green mana for a legendary creature avatar. He's an 8/8 with trample. He has 3 very unique effects. The first is you can't spend mana to cast it. You can only cast it by using its Convoke and Delve. Delve is an ability where you can exile a card from your graveyard to pay 1 generic, and Convoke is each creature you tap while casting the spell pays for 1 mana, either generic or of that creature's color. Finally, you can cast Hogak from your graveyard. So, what this card is saying is, I'm going to tap 3 mana, I'm going to put 2 cards into my graveyard, which I can then exile to help play Hogak. So normally, your mana doesn't translate so directly into playing Hogak unless you're putting a creature out. Casting spells, unless they're dumping cards into your graveyard, doesn't allow you to play Hogak any faster. But you can imagine a scenario where on turns 1 and 2, I've put out some creatures so that I can use those to tap for the Convoke part of Hogak, which will take care of the colored mana. This card on turn 3 is going to draw 2 and put 2 into the graveyard. So it's just going to get me to Hogak that much faster. Especially if your turn 1 or turn 2 play is also putting stuff in the graveyard. This could be the thing that pushes you to the 5 and gets your Hogak out on turn 3 pretty consistently.
The final card we're going to look at today is Flicker of Fate. It's 1 generic and a white for an instant. Exile target creature or enchantment, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. There are a lot of similar effects in terms of exiling creatures: Acrobatic Maneuver, Ephemerate, Justicar Portal, and a few that return it to the battlefield at the end of turn: Long Road Home, Otherworldly Journey, Liberate, all at instant speed. The unique part about this is that this can exile an enchantment as well. So in addition to the effect of exiling a creature and using that to be able to dodge single target removal or get another enter the battlefield trigger off of a creature that you control, this can also do both of those things for an enchantment. And if you're doing it to an enchantment aura, you get to retarget a new creature with it. So it can have a creature dodge single target removal, have an enchantment dodge single target removal, move an aura to another creature, and trigger a new ETB ability for an enchantment or for a creature. So there's a lot of different directions that this card can do. It's effectively modular. And we know how much Commander players love modular cards. Those options really help you have one card in the deck be able to do more than one thing. It makes it good in more scenarios. So I think that this card is very unique and is very powerful. We're going to look at some synergistic cards with it. There's a keyworded ability called Constellation, which reads, whenever this or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So there are a bunch of effects like that. Eidolon of Blossoms in green is when it or another enchantment enters the battlefield, draw a card. Doom Giant in black is when it or another enchantment enters the battlefield. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. Nihilious Colossus in green is a 6/6, and whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield, double target creature's power or toughness until end of turn. Underworld Coinsmith, which is Orzhov and has the Constellation effect for enter the battlefield, you gain 1 life. Oath of Ancient Wood is green, and whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a 1/1 counter on target creature. The Johnny's Chosen is white. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 cat creature token. So decks like this, if they're running Flicker for any other reason, should probably switch to this new card, Flicker of Fate, because in addition to being able to hit creatures, it can sometimes just give you more triggers of these enchantments and effects that care about enchantments. Additionally, this card synergizes particularly well with sagas, which are a specific kind of enchantment that enter the battlefield and you use their step 1 effect, and then every turn you add a lore counter and use their the next stepped effect. So a good example is History of Benalia, which is 1 generic and 2 white for an enchantment saga, where its first trigger is create a 2/2 white Knight creature token with Vigilance. The second trigger, create a 2/2 white Knight token with Vigilance. The third trigger, Knights you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. So if you have History of Benalia out and you want to flicker it so that you can get more Knight tokens, that's an option. Is that the strongest thing? Is that CEDH level? No, but it is more ways to use this card in a unique fashion. Additionally, we know that in this new set, Theros Beyond Death, they're going to be printing more sagas. So we're going to get more cards for Flicker of Fate to interact with in this very unique way. Moving on to the commanders that are going to look at this card and want it in their deck pretty easily. The first one is Rune of the Hidden Realm, 2 generic green, white, blue for a legendary creature Rhino Soldier 4/4. Vigilance Trample. 2 generic, tap it, exile another target creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So Rune is looking to flicker things and get value off of the flicker. It'll flicker things like Mole Drifter to draw cards and Acidic Slime to destroy things. And that's very powerful. This will give you additional triggers. So if Rune's died a few times or if he's tapped out, you'll still be able to get that effect. And Rune can only target creatures while this can target enchantments. Afara, God of Polis, is the next card we're going to look at. It's 2 generic white and a blue for a 6/5 indestructible legendary enchantment creature god. So as long as your devotion to white and blue is less than 7, Afara isn't a creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you had another creature enter the battlefield under your control, last turn, draw a card. So ET being on a flicker effect like Flicker of Fate, where it leaves the battlefield and comes back, will trigger Afara's second ability. So you can use it to draw a card. So minimally it can cantrip. But if that creature has an ETB effect, like Mole Drifter we were talking about earlier, where you can draw 2 cards, you can flicker it and draw 3 cards. So, or you can use it to flicker Afara, because she's an enchantment and a creature, to protect Afara. Finally, we're going to look at Pramicon Sky Rampart, which is red, white, blue for a legendary creature wall. It's a 1/5 flying defender, and it enters the battlefield. Choose left or right. Each player may attack only the nearest opponent in the chosen direction, and planeswalkers controlled by that opponent. Pramicon, when it gets flickered, you can switch the direction. So if it's the person to your right's turn, you can flicker it so that they can only attack the person to their right, and then you can flicker it again. So more flicker effects in this deck are very good. And on top of this, Pramicon tends to run a lot of enchantments for pillow forting, like Ghostly Prison. As with the other cards we've talked about, if you're going to have these pivotal enchantments, then if you're going to need a flicker option, so you need both of these things, this is kind of the only card that does that. So very high on this card. I think it has a lot of really unique applications, even though it's kind of simple in what it appears to at first, because it's the only one that will flicker enchantment, or one of maybe 3 cards in all of Magic history that does something like that. Kind of indicates to me that it's a pretty strong card and has very unique spots for it. Well, you've made it to the end of my very first episode, and all I can say is thank you very much for listening. Please comment below with new cards you want me to review, what your thoughts on these cards are. Were there any really interesting combos or commanders that I didn't talk about that you think are worth noting? Throw it all in the comments below. If you like the content, like and subscribe. If you have any tips in the form of constructive criticism, please feel free to comment them below or DM me. Until next time, remember, if the blue player has 2 blue mana up, it's probably got a counterspell.